we're not trying to conclude this conversation. We are hoping to start it. So we are very open to criticisms, contributions, and different perspectives. But we will insist that in order to be fruitful, this conversation has to engage with two fundamental realities. So what solutions do we propose to address the problems that beset Australian education, the problems Chris outlined? What is our answer to the question, should all Australian schools be public? We argue that it is time for Australia to establish a common public framework of obligations and responsibilities that applies equally to all taxpayer-funded schools. In other words, a level playing field for all schools to operate on. The first part of this presentation will deal with the what. My goal will be to make it really clear exactly what we mean by the common public framework. After that, I will look at the why, the arguments for a common public framework, before considering some objections to what we're proposing, and then concluding with some remarks about achieving positive change in practical political terms. So
Tom, can I just point out that you might want to change the way you're displaying the slides, because we're getting the slides and thumbnails and notes all shown on our screen. Is that how you wanted to do it, or? No,
I'll just, that's better. Thanks for that, Jeff. Okay, so what do we mean by this common public framework for all Australian schools? In the first instance, publicly funded schools should not be permitted to charge entrance fees. And that's, just to go back, this is really the essence of what we're proposing, that all taxpayer-funded schools should be free to the user. And then publicly funded schools should not be permitted to have exclusive or selective enrolment practices, other than those strictly defined to support their special ethos. So we believe, and international examples illustrate, it's perfectly possible to have common enrolment obligations while allowing for diverse kind of ethos amongst schools. The additional element of the common public framework is that all schools are entitled to full public funding. Otherwise, they have to charge fees and have to charge the user. And finally, and really critically, what the common public framework would involve is needs-based funding, not in the sense, in the sense that no matter the sector, students in comparable schools should receive exactly the same total funding. And that's quite different to, say, the Gonski plan, which was called needs-based funding, but it always meant non-government schools would receive a needs-based funding amount and then charge fees at whatever level they like, and by virtue of that have a total resource advantage over comparable public schools. All right, so what's this going to look like in practice? Well, we get a really kind of practical example if we look at a place like Ontario in Canada. So, you know, when we abolished state aid here in Australia in the 19th century, the Canadians went down a different path where they decided to extend full public funding to minority religious schools. So what that means today is that Catholic schools in Ontario are free, they're fully publicly funded, and in access and enrolments, they are just as public as Australian public schools. At the same time, in character and ethos, they are just as Catholic as Australian Catholic schools. Now, we're not saying we have to imitate exactly what a place like Ontario does, but it gives us a really concrete sense of how we could have very different arrangements than what we're used to here in Australia. And it's certainly not just Canada. In places like Netherlands, New Zealand, Belgium, Scotland, countries around the world, church schools are fully funded, but they're also fully accessible, and much more accessible than church schools in Australia. who largely exclude the poor, as Chris showed. All right, so that's what Chris and I propose in chapter 10 of Waiting for Gonski. And I'd now like to move to the next part of the speech, which is why. How would what we're proposing create better schools and a fairer society? In the first instance, a common public framework eliminates the drivers of segregation. So, Chris showed that graph, which showed how, this increasing concentration of disadvantaged students in the public system. In fact, we have one of the most socially segregated school systems in the OECD. And the main driver of that is unregulated fees. I don't know whether people saw the Sydney Morning Herald report last week, which showed that private school fees in Sydney have increased by 50% over the last decade, despite all the taxpayer funding these schools receive. So of course they exclude the poor. Of course we have a socially segregated school system. This is the first way that a common public framework will eliminate the drivers of segregation. And let's be frank about the situation at the moment. It is, to speak plainly, a system of soft apartheid. Indeed, in many places, the segregation in our school system contains a racial as well as economic dimension. And so that's the first driver of segregation that we would eliminate. A common public framework would likewise prohibit exclusive enrolment practices. And it would end the taxpayer-fueled resource advantages, which help some schools attract advantaged students and high-performing students away from other schools that must be available to all. It would mean that non-government schools would be funded on exactly the same basis as government schools with similar student profiles, size, and location. Our present social hierarchy would be replaced with schools which serve much more socioeconomically mixed student populations. A common public framework would eliminate the segregation that is a blight on our school system. And let's be really, really clear about this. Even if the plan set out by the Gonski review is, really the pole star for progressives and public education advocates, even if it was implemented to the letter, the drivers of segregation would remain completely unaltered. Funding all schools to the schooling resource standard is urgently important. Make no mistake about that. But without a common public framework of obligations and responsibilities for all taxpayer-funded schools, the structural problems will remain. The unworkable combination of public funding with unregulated school fees, the inevitable enrolment discrimination against those who can't pay, and unequal access of schools to the critical resource of high-achieving and advantaged students. What we need is fair funding and a level playing field. So that's the second big reason I want to offer for the common public framework that we're proposing, is that it will address the great problem that Chris pointed out in this chart that we're looking at here. It will reduce the outsized impact of what are called negative peer effects. How's that going to happen? Well, reducing concentrations of social disadvantage in any school means there are less intensive demands on teacher time, increasing the individual attention that each child receives. A larger group of motivated and high-achieving students increases a school's capacity to engender a shared sense of the value of education and a strong culture of attendance and engagement. Thirdly, it can have a powerful effect on the curriculum, both in terms of the subjects that a school offers and also to how teachers pitch lessons to classes. And last but by no means least, the cumulative impact of concentrated disadvantage can take a large toll on teacher morale and affect a school's capacity to recruit and retain teachers, exacerbating the kind of teacher shortages that Chris was talking about. When schools become more socioeconomically mixed, it is much easier to attract and retain staff. And so we get a sense of how a common public framework could transform Australia's education system for the better when we look at Canada. Canada's framework of free, comprehensive schools is much less segregated than Australia's, and it produces much better outcomes than Australia's unlevel playing field. Canada outperformed Australia in all subject areas in the 2018 PISA tests run by the OECD, just as it has in every round of PISA since the test's inception, the start of the century. The PISA student questionnaire also shows that disadvantaged Canadian children are much more likely than their Australian counterparts to feel that they belong at school. Bright Canadian kids from tough backgrounds are more likely to believe they will succeed after school. So it's not just about the outcomes of school, it's about the experience of school. Something is happening in Canada. We're very similar societies in so many ways. This correlation, we argue, is very likely due to the fact that their schools are much more socioeconomically mixed. But it would be wrong to imagine that we face a zero-sum scenario in which more mixed schools will only achieve gains for some at the expense of others. Our school system is actually failing to effectively serve advantaged students and high-achieving students from all backgrounds. In fact, an array of evidence indicates that significant declines in student achievement amongst the most high achieving and most advantaged students across our schools. And study after study has concluded that even though government schools have a large resource advantage over public schools, student achievement is no higher when comparing the results of students from similar social backgrounds. So why is this? Why is our school system not only failing disadvantaged kids, but even advantaged kids? John Hattie, the most influential education researcher in Australia, possibly, explains our predicament this way, and I quote, "Social stratification is sharper in Australia, and a lower proportion go to socially mixed schools than in most countries that we wish to compare, with which we can wish to compare. Paradoxically, this not only leads to more low-income students facing greater obstacles to educational achievement because they are segregated into residualized schools, but also to more cruising schools, serving better off students, but not adding significant value to their educational achievement. This latter trend is a major contributor to Australia's declining educational performance. A common public framework would eliminate the capacity of schools to cherry-pick already high-achieving students. It would therefore shift the focus of innovation and improvement to where it needs to be, value-adding, taking the kids who start behind their peers and turning their lives around. Instead of competing to attract the custom of the most advantaged families, schools will be encouraged to compete on their ability to progress the learning of the most disadvantaged children. So I've suggested 3 arguments for a common public framework. It will reduce segregation, it will reduce the impact of negative peer effects, and it will refocus Australian schools on value adding rather than cherry picking. I now want to consider 2 possible objections to what we're proposing. The first is the argument that it's simply not affordable for governments to fund all Australian schools. Now, this is not the case for the simple reason Chris provided at the start of his presentation. Non-government schools already receive taxpayer funding at similar levels to those of equivalent public schools. In fact, the ABC reported in 2018 that a third of non-government schools receive more taxpayer funding than at least half of comparable public schools. The degree of parity when it comes to taxpayer funding can be seen in this table. What we're seeing here is across the sectors, schools who serve similar kinds of students, a comparison of their funding. So if you look at the bottom row in the table, ICSIA 1,050 to 1,099, these are quite advantaged schools in terms of the students they enroll. And you'll see that independent and Catholic schools get about 95% of the recurrent funding on average as government schools. So it's not much behind in terms of taxpayer funding. And then you move up to the row above and the row above that, which are schools which are really average in terms of the background of the students they enroll. And non-government schools start to actually get more taxpayer funding on average than government schools. So the upshot of all of this is that to fully fund non-government schools at the same level as public schools in a common public framework would cost about $1 billion in additional recurrent expenditure and $1 billion of additional capital expenditure to fund non-government schools in the same way public schools currently are. So it's not a question of affordability, it's a question of priorities. We argue that we cannot afford not to address the fundamental causes of inequity and underachievement in Australia's school system. If we're going to have a conversation about skills, about full employment, about improving productivity, we simply cannot afford to ignore the drivers of the declining achievement in our schools. I want to turn now to a second quite different objection, and that is the question of whether public funding should be provided to religious schools at all. Or if state aid is an inescapable reality, should it be as minimal as possible? On this account, we definitely shouldn't fully fund church schools. Our response is effectively, why not? Perfectly secular countries like New Zealand, Canada, and the Netherlands fully publicly fund church schools. In practice, it means that every citizen can access a free, publicly funded education, irrespective of their conscientious beliefs about whether education should include a religious dimension. It is a pluralistic form of secularism in which no group, religious or otherwise, is favoured by the state. Chris and I have devoted our careers to working in secular state schools. We will always argue that the tolerance, diversity and inclusivity they embody is the best option for every child, no matter what background they come from. But at a certain point, it is better to agree to disagree. State aid was abolished in the 19th century, and the consequence then was that public education did not provide what 1/4 of the population wanted from education. A public education system should be big enough to contain the disagreements and diversity that define our community. Finally, I want to make some brief remarks on on achieving change. So if there's a philosophical case to extend full public funding along with public obligations to all schools, the pragmatic argument is even stronger. Opposing public funding of religious schools has not only proved to be futile, but self-defeating. It has produced a powerful coalition of the religious and the rich, what Gough Whitlam once called an alliance of God and Mammon. And it is this alliance which undergirds the status quo and makes positive change next to impossible. Consider the No School Loses a Dollar demand that derailed the Gonski process. It effectively conflated the situation of the most overfunded, luxuriously resourced and exclusive high-fee independent school with that of the struggling parish school in the outer suburbs of our cities or in our regional towns. Whenever the case for equity has been made over the last 50 years, elitism has been defended via an appeal to religious choice. Instead of getting even further bogged down in this stalemate, we need to radically reshape the conversation and build a choice and equity coalition to defeat the elitists. A choice and equity coalition founded on the idea that every publicly funded school should be free. A choice and equity coalition united in opposition to the use of public monies to provide some children with privileges not available to others, and to publicly fund schools that, and public funding of schools that are only available to the few. We need to isolate the elitists and focus our attack exclusively on them. Imagine if politicians were able to go to the electorate promising not only needs-based funding, but the end of school fees as well. It's a vision that is ambitious and would have to be fought for, but it is achievable. In conclusion, Chris and I strongly believe that to achieve progress in Australian education, we need to start a new conversation. A conversation that imagines new possibilities and sets aside outdated assumptions. In offering a potential solution, a common public framework for all Australian schools, we're not trying to conclude this conversation. We are hoping to start it. So we are very open to criticisms, contributions, and different perspectives. But we will insist that in order to be fruitful, this conversation has to engage with two fundamental realities. Firstly, Australia's school system is highly segregated and characterised by pronounced concentrations of social disadvantage. And secondly, there is an extensive body of evidence that shows that these concentrations profoundly harm student learning. Like all evidence, this research can be contested. It is open to varying interpretations. There are numerous potential policy responses. But to simply ignore it, as much policy debate does at present, witness today's Productivity Commission report, is neither intellectually honest or morally defensible. The question then for all of us is, if a common public framework is not the best way to address these pressing problems, what is? Thank you very much.